Time for the Revolutionary Spotlight with Saratoga 250. I'm Walt Adams. Our special guest in the studio is Lauren Roberts, Saratoga County historian.
All right, thanks for joining us today. We are going to listen to the story of Lady Harriet Acland. We are continuing our exploration of roles women played in the American Revolution, and especially in the campaign of 1777. So, Anne, can you tell us a little bit about who Lady Acland was?
Harriet was a woman who had traveled from England to North America with her husband, an officer in Burgoyne's army. And this wasn't necessarily uncommon for a woman, especially in this case, a woman of decent rank in society, in British society, to travel with her husband. We need to remember also how long it took to traverse from one side of the ocean to the other. So if a couple wanted to remain together in the same place at the same time, she might choose to travel with her spouse. And so they come over by ship and they are landing in Canada. And then there is that long journey down in through upstate New York. And sometimes the officers' wives would actually stay in garrison at a fort. And they would stay there while their husbands went on the campaign. And this, I believe, was the original plan for Harriet. However, after her husband was injured, she decides that she needs to join him and help him out and to care for him. And then she continues staying with him throughout the journey.
Lady Acland was the wife of an officer. Her experience would have been a little bit different, right, than one of the normal camp followers in the British Army. She certainly would have had servants. She would have had better food, a better place to stay inside a tent, let's say. Mm-hmm. And maybe this type of shelter kind of gets them in trouble. It seems like maybe they even had a dog that traveled with them. So this certainly would have been, different than a camp follower. Can you tell us about one of her adventures?
Yes. So when there were structures available, they would certainly be staying in a house or something like that. But when that wasn't a possibility, they did have a tent that they stayed in. And they also had a dog named Jack Ketch. And this dog traveled with them. They also had a maid that was traveling with them that was caring for Harriet and taking care of her needs. But that dog knocked over a candle one night in the tent. And flames plus canvas are not a good combination. And the tent caught fire, and there was pure chaos. They don't know who's made it out of the tent, who has not. And so Harriet apparently rolled out from underneath the tent canvas on one side of the tent, while her husband, John, he's gotten out of the other side, looks around, doesn't see Harriet, and then dives back into the flames to try and rescue his wife. And a soldier nearby goes in after him to try and drag him out. Both men ended up being burned and having wounds as a result of this calamity. But eventually, Harriet, and John are reunited and realize that they are safe. They lose pretty much everything they owned, but again, they're safe.
Okay, so he's already been wounded once, and then he gets burned in a tent fire, and we still haven't gotten to the Battles of Saratoga yet. And there's still more adventure to come after these last few episodes. Can you tell us about her biggest adventure yet once she gets into the Battles of Saratoga?
Yes, we are able to know about Harriet's experiences because she, or at least someone traveling with her, did keep a journal. It's fairly brief, but another one of the women who were traveling on the Burgoyne campaign kept a much more detailed account and published that as a memoir, and that was the Baroness Riedesel. And through her accounts, we are able to learn so much more about what Harriet was enduring through all of this. And we find out through her that the major, Harriet's husband, is wounded, shot through both legs during the battle. And There is another soldier that tries to rescue him and get him back to the British lines, but they're not able to make it.
So this is the second battle, right? The Battle of Bemis Heights.
Yes.
And after the British lose this, they're in a retreat. So Burgoyne has to leave the hospital behind, right? He doesn't have time to get the wounded.
Exactly. So the major is left behind, and he is taken as a prisoner of war. And so he ends up in the American camp. And Harriet finds out about this, and she once again feels the need to reach her husband, to care for him, to make sure that he's alive, and to care for his wounds if he is. So she begins campaigning and trying to gain access to cross enemy lines to get to her husband. So she is actually approaching the general of the army, Burgoyne, to request permission. And this is something that Burgoyne even himself later recounts. I received a message from Lady Harriet submitting to my decision a proposal and expressing an earnest solicitude to execute it, if not interfering with my designs of passing to the camp of the enemy and requesting General Gates's permission to attend her husband. Though I was ready to believe, for I had experienced that patience and fortitude in a supreme degree were to be found, as well as every other virtue under the most tender forms, I was astonished at this proposal. After so long an agitation of the spirits, exhausted not only for want of rest, but absolutely want of food, drenched in rains for 12 hours together, that a woman should be capable of such an undertaking as delivering herself to the enemy, probably in the night, and uncertain of what hands they might first fall into, appeared an effort above human nature.
So Burgoyne says yes. In a lot more words than that. He agrees to let her go and writes to Gates, and then she has yet another adventure.
Yes, so she gets the permission, that's what she wanted, and she actually takes a few people with her on this journey. So she has the chaplain of the British Army, Reverend Brudenell. He travels with her. And then there is also a soldier who had previously attended her husband kind of as a servant and who also has been wounded. And then she also has her lady's maid traveling with her as well, Polly. And they are all in a boat, and they are crossing the Hudson River and approaching the American army in darkness. Now, this does not seem like a good or a safe idea because everyone is on edge. There has just been a battle. There are wounded, and it is just chaos. And so they are on the river. There's a flag of truce that the Reverend Brudenell is holding, and the Americans are very, very concerned. They don't know exactly what's going on, and they hold off that boat and force them to wait for hours. And so there are these 4 people in this boat in the Hudson through the night, and waiting for their chance to enter the American camp. And this is an ordeal made even more complicated by the fact that Harriet is pregnant at this time as well, too.
She does eventually get to her husband, and what happens? Does he survive?
Yes, happy to report that John did survive his wounds. They were reunited. John survived. He had been shot through both legs, but it was a survivable injury. He did not require any amputation or anything like that, but he was very limited in his mobility for a long time.
And when they become prisoners of war, because they're still part of Burgoyne's army and the Convention Army, what happens to them?
So they certainly have a different experience than your typical woman who is following the army, who is going to have to carry all of her possessions on her back and care for her children and march and walk for miles upon miles. That is not the case for Harriet and John. They become house guests of the Schuyler family. And so they are transported by wagon or carriage into Albany, and they are warmly greeted by Catherine Schuyler, and they stay with them for a few days. This was their experience, again, very different from what was happening to the many, many others who were having to march and through all sorts of weather.
And this is the same Schuyler family who just had their northern estate up in modern-day Schuylerville, but what was then called Saratoga, burned to the ground by the British Army when Burgoyne was on his retreat. he orders that the Schuyler's estate is burned. And yet days later, the Schuyler family is welcoming members of the British Army, the surrendered army, into their home in Albany. And Catherine Schuyler has a lot to do with the hospitality and their stay, making sure that this group of now prisoners of war made up of British officers and their families are taken care of in their home. It's a pretty interesting way of war.
Absolutely. And part of this, I feel at least, is that Philip Schuyler is wanting to prove himself as a gentleman. He wants to ensure that this British aristocracy that has been rolling its way through his territory realizes that these Americans are certainly capable of gentlemanly behavior, hospitality, and he wants to prove that through his own actions and by sharing his own resources.
So still very concerned with honor, even
Absolutely.
though the American Army. All right, well, thank you so much for sharing the story of Lady Harriet Acland. Again, one of those memoirs that we're able to pull information from, both from Lady Acland's own travelogue, but also her friend, Lady Frederica Riedesel, the Baroness, her extended memoirs. So we're able to pull from different primary sources to tell this story. If you're interested in learning more, check out Saratoga250.com for even more stories about women in the Revolution.
The Revolutionary Spotlight with Saratoga 250.